In the winter of 1982, the world of 16 Native women, each with vibrant lives, families, and a fierce connection to their culture, was tragically and violently shattered. They had been outspoken about the injustices their community faced, fighting for land rights, tribal sovereignty, and the protection of their heritage. But their voices, too loud for some to tolerate, were silenced. On a cold winter morning, these 16 women, ages ranging from 20 to 40, vanished without a trace. The only thing found was a single, broken necklace on the snow-covered ground. No struggle, no signs of resistance, just an eerie, quiet disappearance. The authorities were quick to write it off. A runaway case, they said. Perhaps the women had run off into the wilderness, desperate to escape their suffocating lives. Some whispered about the long-standing tension between the reservation and the outside world, especially the corporate interests eyeing their land, but nothing was ever proven. No search was conducted with urgency, no one pushed for answers. The women were erased, their families left in the dark. The community's grief became a hushed secret, buried beneath layers of silence and shame. In the years that followed, the case was quietly dismissed, and the names of the women became a footnote in history, lost to time. 35 years later, in 2017, a construction team working on a renovation project for a new community center on the old reservation grounds was digging beneath the foundation of an old church that had long stood as a silent witness to many untold stories. The church had served as both a refuge and a reminder of the past, but what lay beneath its foundations was far darker than anyone had anticipated. As the crew worked, the earth beneath them shifted. A metal object was found first. Buried deep in the ground, it seemed out of place. It wasn't a tool or any familiar item. It was something old, heavy, and sealed. Curiosity piqued, the crew dug deeper. The earth was thick, packed tight from years of neglect. But as the workers cleared the dirt, what emerged wasn't just an object. It was the skeleton of a woman. Shocked and horrified, the workers called in authorities who quickly arrived on the scene. The remains, at first glance, looked old, but their discovery in such an unusual location, beneath the church, was staggering. This wasn't just some forgotten burial, there was something hidden here. The woman's remains were surrounded by personal items, clothing, and what seemed like a journal wrapped in an old cloth. As authorities combed through the site, more remains were discovered. Not one, not two, but 16. One by one, the remains of the 16 missing women, who had vanished in 1982, were exhumed from beneath the church. The women had been hidden beneath the church for decades, buried in secret, their disappearance a carefully orchestrated act of violence and cover-up. But why were they buried here, beneath this sacred space, and who had left them to rot in silence for over 3 decades? As investigators began piecing together the horrific puzzle, they uncovered chilling evidence in the journal found alongside the remains. The journal belonged to one of the women, Nina Bearclaw, the eldest of the group. In her handwriting, she described being captured alongside her sisters and locked away in a hidden underground room by people they had trusted. Nina's last entry read, "They thought they could silence us forever. But I won't let them forget what they did. We weren't meant to be kept here, we were meant to be free, but they stole that from us. My only hope now is that someone, someday, will find us and make them answer." The bones, each one carefully catalogued and removed, told a haunting story. What was once thought of as a random disappearance or a foolish legend now had weight, the weight of truth. 16 women, all buried beneath the very ground that had once been a sanctuary. In the days following the discovery, a team of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and local law enforcement arrived at the scene. The bodies, now carefully exhumed, were in various stages of decay. The women had been hidden beneath the church for over 3 decades, their remains stacked against one another like forgotten objects. But what the workers hadn't expected to find was the eerie positioning of the bodies. They were arranged in what appeared to be a ritualistic pattern, almost like the women had been placed with care, their bodies intentionally arranged. Among the bones were personal belongings, necklaces, old photos, and carved wooden tokens, items that had clearly belonged to the women during their lives. These were relics of a different time, long before they were silenced. As the forensic team worked, the true gravity of the situation began to sink in. The women's remains were not just hidden, they were carefully concealed, buried beneath the church floor, an area considered sacred by the community. There was no plausible explanation for this, no reason that could justify such an act. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a case of disappearances. This was something far more sinister. The community was stunned, shaken to its core by the implications. The families who had lived with the absence of their loved ones for over 3 decades now found themselves confronted with a painful reality. Their sisters, daughters, and mothers had not simply vanished, they had been taken, mistreated, and murdered. Their deaths covered up by those who should have been their protectors. The church had been the center of life for this community for generations. To find that this sacred space had been a part of such a heinous act was a blow too heavy to bear. But there was more. The remains were not simply discarded, they were arranged. Each woman's remains, carefully placed in the dark, cold earth beneath the church floor, suggested that they were treated as something to be hidden, not just in death, but in life. The church had been the final place they were meant to be silenced. The church, once a place of refuge, had become the site of unimaginable betrayal. Questions began to surface. Why here? Why under the church? What had happened to these women? What had led them to be killed, buried, and forgotten? The investigations began in earnest, though not without resistance. There was pushback from some in the community who had long trusted the church. The thought that such a sacred place could be the site of something so sinister was almost too much to bear. For some, the truth was too horrifying to accept. The church had always been seen as a protector of the community, a symbol of faith and refuge. But as investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered a disturbing connection between the church and the local boarding school system that had been so deeply involved in the forced assimilation of Native children. It wasn't just that the church was a witness to the violence, it was complicit. Documents began to surface, pointing to the church's active role in harboring government agents, those responsible for the surveillance, detention, and disappearance of those who dared resist the government's policies. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators unearthed a hidden compartment beneath the church's altar. Inside, they found old photographs, some of which showed the women in better times, before their voices were silenced, before they were hidden away. The women had been more than victims. They had been activists, leaders, and resistors. They had fought for their community, their land, and their way of life. In the face of systemic oppression, they had spoken out. And for that, they had been targeted. As the photographs were analyzed, it became clear that the women had not simply disappeared, they had been captured. The presence of a military-issued camera, found buried with the remains, suggested that they had been under constant surveillance, their every move monitored by those who feared their resistance. The photographs were not only a record of their lives, but a record of their subjugation and eventual death. Forensic evidence also pointed to the possibility that the women had been murdered before being hastily buried. There were signs of strangulation, blunt force trauma, and other wounds that didn't fit with the story authorities had initially told. The timeline of their disappearance began to make less sense. If the women had been killed in 1982, why had their bodies been hidden beneath the church for so long? What had happened in those early days of the disappearance? And why had the church, the community's supposed protector, played such an active role in silencing the women? As the investigation into the disturbing discovery beneath the church floor deepened, the town began to fracture. The shock of the exhumation had left a lasting mark, and now, as the bones of the 16 women were carefully examined, the depth of the conspiracy that had silenced them for over 3 decades started to unfold. Each revelation brought more pain, more questions, and more distrust toward the authorities who had once been trusted to protect these women. The forensic team had already established that the women had not died of natural causes. The wounds on their bodies, the blunt force trauma, the strangulation marks, the fractures, all pointed to deliberate acts of violence. These weren't accidents. These women had been murdered. But why were they killed? And why were their bodies so carefully hidden beneath the church? As the bones were examined more closely, something else emerged. The bodies weren't arranged haphazardly. Each woman was placed with deliberate care, positioned in ways that seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial. One woman was placed with her hands crossed over her chest, another with a handwritten letter tucked beneath her body, as if it had been placed there as a final message. These were no random victims. They were sacrifices, perhaps to something much larger than the community realized. The photograph found earlier of the women in the better days of their lives had been analyzed by the team. It was the last known photograph of them, taken just before they vanished. The women stood proudly together, their faces filled with hope and strength. But the most chilling part of the photograph was the figure lurking in the background, a man in uniform. His presence was a mystery. The uniform was like no other, a military issue that suggested a higher involvement in their disappearance. He had been following them, watching them, perhaps even orchestrating their capture. The chilling realization struck the investigation team. These women had not just vanished, they had been hunted. They had been targeted because they had dared to speak out against the injustices that plagued their community. The more the investigators dug into the past, the more they uncovered a network of collusion between the church, local law enforcement, and government officials. A secret collaboration had been taking place, one that involved the systematic silencing of native voices. The church, a place that was supposed to protect and guide its flock, had become a hub for oppressive forces, hiding the very people it was meant to help. Documents began to surface, government memos, church records, and military reports, all pointing to the same disturbing truth. These women had been silenced because they were seen as a threat to the system that had been in place for years. They had been troublemakers, speaking out against land theft, forced assimilation, and the systemic abuse of their people. The truth was more insidious than anyone had imagined. These women had been murdered in cold blood for their resistance, their fight to protect their land and their culture. And the people responsible were hiding in plain sight, protected by a system that had turned a blind eye to their disappearance for far too long. It was then that Anna Whitecloud, the granddaughter of one of the missing women, decided to take matters into her own hands. Having followed the investigation from a distance, Anna knew that the official route wasn't going to get them the answers they needed. She had always suspected that something larger was at play. There was always something off about the way the authorities had responded to the disappearances. Now, with the evidence piling up, Anna knew the time had come to face the truth head-on. Anna had grown up hearing the stories from her grandmother, stories of how the women had fought to protect their heritage and their land. Her grandmother had been one of the voices silenced, and Anna felt a personal connection to the case. She had always believed that the truth was buried somewhere beneath the layers of government corruption, and she was determined to find it. With a team of independent journalists, local historians, and community leaders, Anna began to dig deeper into the church's involvement. The most critical question remained: who was the man in the photograph? Her research led her to an old government report from 1982, a report detailing military operations that targeted Native communities across the country. The document mentioned a special project in the region, one that was classified as re-education, but whose true purpose was far darker. The operation, run by government agents, was designed to monitor, control, and silence Native activism. The men behind the operation were part of a network of government officials and religious figures who saw Native resistance as a direct threat to their control over the land. Anna's breakthrough came when she found an official record linked to the military man in the photograph. His name was John Harrington, a former military officer with ties to several covert operations on Native lands. The report confirmed that Harrington had been actively involved in surveilling and detaining individuals who spoke out against the government. He had been present in the community in 1982, around the time the women went missing. The discovery was earth-shattering. The man in the photo wasn't just a bystander. He was a key player in the forced disappearance of the 16 women. But the question remained: why had the authorities allowed him to act with impunity? Why had they allowed such atrocities to happen under their watch? As Anna's investigation gained traction, she began to see the connections. The church, the military, and the government, they were all part of a web of silence and control designed to keep Native voices quiet and oppressed. The women, who had been the voices of resistance, had been targeted because they were a threat to the system. Anna's heart raced as she pieced together the puzzle. The discovery of the photograph and the military report had shattered the carefully constructed narrative the community had lived with for decades. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized how deeply this story ran, far beyond the walls of the church or the reservation. It was a story about systematic erasure, of a government intent on silencing voices that threatened their agenda. The more she dug into the official records from 1982, the clearer it became that the 16 women had been targeted not just for speaking out against the land grabs and forced assimilation, but because they were seen as a symbol of resistance to a larger, more insidious plan. They were leaders in their community, women who refused to conform to the oppressive systems designed to strip away their heritage, their rights, their culture. In the weeks that followed, Anna and her team continued to uncover more details, leading them to a chilling revelation. The church, once seen as a place of refuge, had been complicit in their deaths. Evidence of meeting notes, church sermons, and internal letters between government officials suggested that the women's resistance had been seen as a threat to the status quo. Their disappearance was not an accident. It was a carefully executed plan to break their spirit, to make an example of them. The women had been detained and held in underground rooms, kept hidden in plain sight for months. During this time, they were forced to undergo interrogation by men in uniform, often subjected to threats and violence. The military man, John Harrington, had been directly involved in the operation that silenced them. But why? Why were these women deemed so dangerous? The answer, Anna suspected, was tied to the land itself. The women had spoken out not just against the conditions of the boarding school system, but also against the exploitation of native land that was being sold off to corporations and outsiders without the consent of the tribes. They were standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar deal. Their voices could have inspired others to rise up, to fight for their land, their culture, their people. And that was something the authorities could not allow. As Anna continued her investigation, she began to reach out to other families who had been affected by the disappearances. She spoke with surviving relatives, old friends, and community members who remembered the missing women, their names, their faces, and their tireless fight for justice. Some of the stories were painful to hear, others were more cryptic, but they all pointed in one direction. The women had been captured, and their deaths had been covered up to protect those in power. Anna had spent most of her life feeling like an outsider. Raised on the fringes of the community, she was disconnected from the core of the tribe. But as she uncovered more of the truth, she began to feel a deep, personal connection to the women she had never met. They were her grandmothers, her aunts, her mothers, and their fight was her fight. One night, as she sat alone in her study, Anna read through the last letter found beneath one of the bodies. The letter, written by her grandmother, contained a plea for help, a final wish for justice before she was taken. Her grandmother's words were desperate, but they also carried a strange resolve. The letter read, "I don't know how much longer we can hold on. They are watching us, waiting for the right time to take us. We can't let them win. The truth must come out no matter what. I hope one day someone will find us. I hope they will hear our stories and know that we were never afraid." Reading her grandmother's words, Anna was filled with a quiet rage and a deep sorrow. These women had been forced to pay the ultimate price for their resistance, and the world had been allowed to move on without ever knowing the truth. But Anna wasn't going to let that happen. She would carry the weight of their stories. She would make sure they were heard. The investigation took a new turn when Anna received a sealed envelope from an anonymous source. Inside was a set of photographs, each one darker and more disturbing than the last. The photos, taken around the time of the women's disappearance, showed them at the church. Not as they had been portrayed in their last moments of freedom, but in chains, locked up in a room beneath the church. The images were haunting, the faces of the women filled with fear and determination. The letters on the back of each photo confirmed what Anna had feared. The women were never intended to be set free. They had been part of a secret program, a covert operation designed to break their spirits and neutralize any resistance. The final photograph was the most chilling. It showed the bodies of the women stacked against one another, hidden under the floorboards of the church. One of the women had managed to carve a symbol into the wooden floor, a symbol that Anna recognized from her grandmother's diary. The symbol was tied to an old native legend, a story of spiritual resistance, of standing firm against those who sought to destroy their land and culture. The women, even in death, had left a message of defiance. The investigation had taken on a new urgency. As Anna pored over the newly discovered photographs, a mix of anger and determination filled her. These images, along with her grandmother's letter, painted a clear picture of what had happened to the 16 women. They weren't simply lost, they had been hunted, captured, and silenced because of the threat they posed to those in power. Each photograph revealed the cold, calculated steps taken to make them disappear. The chains, the locked rooms, the constant surveillance. The women had been detained, forced to live in captivity under the guise of protection, but in reality they were isolated and left to suffer in secret. They had been used to try and quash any opposition to the land grabs and the system of assimilation that sought to erase their culture and identity. Anna had seen the photographs, but it wasn't until she held the final image, the one showing the bodies buried beneath the church, that she fully understood the depth of the conspiracy. The bodies weren't just buried. They were arranged carefully, with mementos, jewelry, and personal belongings placed around them. As if their identities, their memories were being deliberately preserved, even in death. But why? What purpose did it serve? It was then that Anna received a call from Tommy Littlefeather. an elder from the tribe who had been part of the early investigations into the disappearances. Tommy had been there when the women vanished, and he had his own suspicions about what happened. He had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid of the repercussions. But now, after all these years, he couldn't stay silent any longer. "I remember seeing them." Tommy's voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking into Anna's chest. "I saw them being taken from the church. They were tied up, forced into trucks. They weren't alone, either. I saw others, other men, people in suits. I thought it was just some kind of mistake, but now, I know better." Tommy's revelation sent chills down Anna's spine. It confirmed what she had feared all along. The women hadn't just been detained by local authorities. They had been moved, hidden, and possibly transported to a secret location. The church, long believed to be a place of refuge, had been complicit in hiding them. But where had they been taken? Tommy went on, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was told to keep quiet. They made me promise. But when I saw those photos, I knew the truth. They were silenced, and we were all made to forget. But I can't forget them, Anna. I owe it to them to tell the truth." The next day, Anna gathered her team of journalists, investigators, and family members, and they set out to uncover the rest of the story. They began by revisiting the church, now abandoned and decaying, to see if they could find more clues hidden within its walls. The underground chamber where the women's remains had been discovered held more secrets than they had initially realized. Anna and her team spent hours combing through the church's history, going back to the early days of its construction. They found old blueprints, documents that had been archived for years, that showed the underground rooms were originally meant for storage, but in the 1980s they had been repurposed for something darker. The repurposing of these rooms coincided with the military operation detailed in the documents they had found earlier. The church had been transformed into a holding facility, a place where Native activists and dissidents were kept under surveillance, sometimes for months at a time, before being moved, silenced, or even eliminated. Anna's breakthrough came when she uncovered an old ledger that had been hidden in the church's records. The ledger contained a list of names, along with dates and locations. It was clear that the women weren't the only victims. The ledger seemed to suggest that there were more cases, more disappearances that had been covered up, but the records were incomplete. The names listed in the ledger were familiar. They were tribal leaders, activists, teachers, and family members, people who had dared to speak out against the injustices they faced. The missing women, it seemed, were just one part of a larger system designed to quash any form of resistance. As Anna continued to analyze the documents, a chilling realization dawned on her. These women, and so many others, were part of a systematic effort to erase Native voices from the land. The church had served as a hub for this plan, a central point where those who resisted were either disappeared or silenced in ways the public would never see. Her heart heavy with the weight of her discoveries, Anna sat back and reflected on the enormity of the task ahead. The truth was finally within reach, but there were still questions left unanswered. How far did this conspiracy go? Who in the government, the church, and the military had been involved? And what was the ultimate purpose behind these disappearances? As Anna prepared to dig even deeper into the records, a letter arrived at her doorstep. It was sealed with the church's insignia, and the handwriting on the envelope looked familiar. As she opened the letter, the final words written by one of the women before she was taken echoed through her mind. "You're closer than you think. They won't stop coming for you either, but you must not stop. The truth is buried beneath the stones, Anna. Dig deep enough, and you'll find the answers." The letter Anna had received weighed heavily in her hands. The woman who had written it, one of the missing 16, had known that the truth was closer than anyone had believed. The words were a final plea, a cry from the grave that had led Anna to this pivotal moment. The stones beneath which the truth was buried seemed to hold the key to unraveling the mystery. But what did it all mean? What stones was she supposed to dig under? What more could be hidden? The investigation had been a slow burn, but now, with the letter's chilling message in hand, Anna knew she couldn't stop. The truth had been buried beneath the church for far too long, and she was determined to dig up every last bit of it, no matter the cost. Anna began her search by revisiting the old ledger they had found in the church's archives. The names it contained were significant, and each entry seemed to tie into the larger web of disappearances and forced silence that the church had hidden for years. The government's role, the church's involvement, and the military connections all pointed to a single, disturbing truth. These women had not simply been victims of a random act. They had been hunted because they were part of something much bigger, something that threatened the system. As she dug deeper into the ledger, Anna found a name that caught her attention: Father Michael Westridge, the head priest at the church in the 1980s. His name appeared in almost every entry, sometimes linked with government officials, sometimes with military personnel. But what was more troubling was that his signature appeared next to payments made for special services rendered to the school. These services were not detailed, but Anna could guess their meaning. The priest had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had realized. A visit to the town's old archives led Anna to more unsettling findings. Newspaper clippings from the early 1980s described a mysterious rise in disappearances across native reservations, particularly in the area surrounding the church. The authorities had always dismissed these disappearances, but the newspaper reports were full of hushed whispers, with locals afraid to speak out. There was more. As Anna pored over the military documents and government memos found in the church, she uncovered a black operation, one tied to the military-industrial complex. The operation, codenamed Silent Spring, had been launched in the early 1980s. Its goal was to quash native resistance, particularly resistance to the growing efforts to privatize land for corporate interests. This operation had been hiding in plain sight, masked as a public initiative to improve education, health care, and welfare on native reservations. But the truth was much darker. The women had been targeted because they were leaders in the resistance. They had been part of a group that had exposed the corporate interests that were silently taking control of the land. They were labeled as agitators, troublemakers, and their disappearance was no accident. They were removed for a purpose, to ensure that the land remained undisturbed for those in power. Anna's heart sank as the realization hit her. These women weren't just victims, they had been martyrs in a much larger political scheme, a scheme designed to keep their land under corporate control and erase any threat of dissent. But how did the church fit into this dark puzzle? The answer came when Anna revisited the church's records and found a series of secret transactions between Father Westridge and corporate figures. These figures were deeply involved in the land grabs, and Father Westridge had been used as a middleman between the church, the military, and the companies seeking control over native lands. The women had been murdered to prevent them from speaking out, and the church had been the key player in concealing their deaths. The church, Anna now realized, had been more than a passive observer. It had been a silent accomplice, aiding the cover-up while publicly maintaining an image of moral authority. Its role as a place of faith had shielded it from suspicion, and the church had acted under the guise of religious piety while participating in the erasure of native voices. As Anna continued to sift through the photographs, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A small note written on the back of one of the images. The note was brief but clear. The women are buried beneath the stones. The truth will be found when the walls fall. The words were cryptic, but they were also direct. The stones referenced in the letter Anna had received must have been a clue. It was as if the women had left a final message for someone who would come after them. But what walls were they talking about? The walls of the church? The walls of the reservation itself? Anna's thoughts raced as she realized that the church itself had hidden these women, not just physically beneath the ground, but metaphorically beneath the walls of silence it had built for decades. The church was the literal and symbolic wall that had held the truth prisoner. The final clue lay in the foundation, in the very stones the church had been built upon. Determined to find the answers, Anna returned to the church, now in a state of decay. The building stood as a shadow of what it once was, but Anna was focused on one thing: uncovering the final secret hidden beneath its floor. She had to find what the women had left behind. She took a deep breath as she entered the church, knowing that the final pieces of the puzzle were just within reach. The bones of the 16 women, their sacrificial arrangement, the letters and the symbols had all led to this moment. Now, she would uncover the one truth that had been hidden for over 30 years, the full extent of the betrayal. The church loomed before Anna like a shadow of its former self. The grand structure, once a symbol of refuge and faith, now stood in eerie silence, its crumbling walls holding the weight of centuries of secrets. Every step Anna took inside felt like she was walking on hallowed ground, yet the air was thick with something much darker than reverence. It was as if the walls themselves held memories that wanted to remain hidden, buried beneath the stones that had been laid so carefully over the years. Anna had returned to the church with one singular purpose: to uncover the final truth. The cryptic letter, the military documents, and the photographs had all led her here. Now, she needed to find the one thing that would bring it all into focus. The women's final message, left for her to discover, had pointed to the stones beneath the church, but Anna knew that wasn't the only mystery waiting to be solved. The final betrayal had yet to be revealed. As Anna knelt before the altar, she felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The women who had died here had been buried beneath the very foundation of what was once considered sacred. They had been victims, yes, but they had also been fighters, women who had challenged the status quo, women who had refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Their deaths had been a sacrifice, but it had been a sacrifice that had never been acknowledged. Anna ran her fingers over the floor, tracing the stone slabs, feeling for any sign, any marking that would lead her to the truth. She wasn't sure how long she had been there when she noticed it. A slight indentation in one of the stones, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. She felt it with her fingers, pressing gently. There was a faint click, and the stone shifted slightly beneath her touch. A hidden compartment. Her breath caught in her throat as she worked to remove the stone. It didn't take much force. The slab came free with a groan, revealing a dark cavity beneath the floor. Inside, there were no tunnels, no hidden rooms, but what she found instead was even more unsettling. Wrapped in an old cloth, tucked carefully inside the compartment, was a small, weathered box. Anna's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of documents, photos, and relics, all the remnants of a life left behind. There were letters from the missing women, some of which had never been seen before. They were personal accounts of the brutality they had suffered, accounts of how they had been held captive and interrogated for months before their deaths. But there was one piece of evidence that stood out above all the rest: a handwritten letter, signed by Father Michael Westridge. The letter was short, but its contents were damning. It detailed the final instructions given to the priest after the women's deaths. instructions that clearly laid out the cover-up. Westridge had been responsible for arranging their burial beneath the church, ensuring that their bodies were never found. The letter read, "The women have been dealt with. They are no longer a threat to the order we've worked so hard to establish. Their bodies must be hidden well, far from prying eyes. We must protect the church at all costs. The truth cannot be allowed to surface. The land must remain under our control, and their voices will not reach the outside world. We will ensure that nothing is left behind." Anna's hands shook as she read the letter. The words were a direct confession, and they made the truth clear. The women had not just been silenced in death, they had been erased, their memory buried alongside their bodies. The church had not just been an unwilling participant, it had been instrumental in the cover-up. The operation had been carefully planned, and the women's deaths had been a necessary sacrifice in order to keep the land under control and protect the corporate interests that had been quietly taking over. Anna's mind raced. She now had the evidence she needed. This wasn't just about the church anymore. It was about a systematic conspiracy to destroy Native resistance, to wipe out any voices that threatened the corporate and government interests that had been quietly infiltrating the reservation lands. But as she continued to go through the rest of the documents, something caught her eye. A name. A name she had seen before, but never in this context. It was the name of John Harrington, the military man who had been present in the photograph. The connection between Harrington and Westridge had never been clear before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The more she read, the more it became clear. Harrington had been working closely with the church to carry out the operation, overseeing the capture of those who were seen as a threat to the government's plan. The women had been among the first casualties of a larger plan to silence the resistance. The church had been used as a cover, a shield, a place where the women's deaths could be hidden from the world. But the truth, as Anna had learned, was never as simple as it seemed. Anna knew that the evidence she had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. There were still dark corners to explore, still people who had been involved, still bigger players who needed to be exposed. She couldn't stop now. The women's memory, the truth they had fought for, demanded to be heard. With the evidence she had in her hands, Anna knew she could bring the truth to light. The world needed to know what had happened to those 16 women, and the rest of the community needed to know the price they had paid for their resistance. Anna's resolve hardened as she stared at the confession letter from Father Westridge. The church had been part of something much larger than anyone had ever suspected. A systematic campaign to silence those who fought for their land, their people, and their culture. The more Anna uncovered, the clearer it became that the disappearances were not the isolated acts of violence she had once thought. They were the tip of an iceberg of oppression, betrayal, and systemic cruelty. The more she thought about the hidden room beneath the church, the more she realized the truth was not confined to the women's deaths. It had been a carefully planned cover-up. The bodies, buried beneath the stones of the very foundation of the church, were not just hidden out of sight. They were buried beneath the weight of an entire system designed to erode Native voices and marginalize them. This was about more than just land theft. This was about an agenda to erase the people who stood in the way of corporate and governmental power. The ledger Anna had found was still open on her desk. The names in it kept haunting her. Names of people who had been involved, or at least complicit, in the dark dealings. Some of the names were local figures, like Father Westridge. Others were military personnel, corporate leaders, and even high-ranking government officials. These people had made decisions that changed lives, erased entire communities, and in the case of the 16 women, sealed their fates. Anna turned the pages of the ledger and found a note scrawled in the margins. written in the same handwriting as the earlier documents. "We need to act quickly. The women cannot be allowed to speak out. They have found the cracks in the system. We cannot afford to let this spread." The note was signed with the signature Anna recognized: John Harrington. The military officer had been involved in covering up more than just the women's deaths. He had been a key player in ensuring that any evidence of the government's deep involvement in these operations was systematically erased. As she continued through the archives, Anna found herself at a crossroads. She had all the evidence, the military documents, the church's internal records, the ledger, and the photographs that painted a clear picture of a cover-up that spanned decades. But there was something missing, the final pieces that would tie everything together. Who else had been involved? And what were the next steps in the pursuit of justice? Anna's breakthrough came when she turned her attention back to the photos. The picture of the 16 women, taken shortly before their disappearance, had shown them at their most hopeful, their faces full of defiance. But there was something about the background that Anna hadn't noticed before. In the shadows, partially obscured by a tree, was a man, a government agent standing just behind the group of women. The man was not familiar to her, but something about his stance and his position caught her eye. His face wasn't fully visible, but his uniform stood out. It was a military issue, but unlike the other uniforms Anna had seen in the documents, this one had extra insignia, markings that were foreign to her. Using the resources she had from the archives, Anna traced the military unit the man might have belonged to. It was a Black Ops unit, one involved in covert operations on native lands in the 1980s. The unit's mission was to handle security threats in sensitive areas, though the reports were vague. What was even more troubling was that the unit had been involved in disappearances, detaining civilians and suppressing unrest, activities that were conducted under the guise of national security. The photo of the man, now linked to this covert unit, connected the dots. The 16 women had not been taken by random forces. They had been targeted as part of a much larger operation to control the resistance movement and prevent the native tribes from unifying in their fight against corporate and governmental land grabs. Anna's hands shook as she pieced the puzzle together. The women had been taken to prevent a rebellion. They had been disappeared, not because they were a threat in themselves, but because they were seen as symbols of a larger fight. They had dared to resist, and for that, they had paid the ultimate price. The final pieces fell into place when Anna discovered the last document in the church's records. It was a memo marked urgent. The memo, sent by an anonymous source, detailed the fate of the women, and it was signed by Father Westridge and John Harrington. The document detailed how the women had been trapped, interrogated, and then executed after they had been deemed too dangerous. The memo's chilling final line read, "We cannot afford any loose ends. The women must be dealt with." The names of several high-ranking officials were mentioned, though their identities were carefully hidden. It was clear, however, that this was more than just a case of murder. This was an elaborate cover-up designed to protect the perpetrators at any cost. With the final piece of the puzzle in hand, Anna knew what she had to do next. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was undeniable. She would take the story to the media, no matter the risk. The world needed to know what had happened to the 16 women, and those responsible for their deaths had to be held accountable. But she wasn't naive. She knew that powerful forces would try to shut her down, just as they had tried to silence the women in 1982. But now, with the truth in her hands, Anna was determined to ensure that their voices would not be buried again. The legacy of those 16 women, the martyrs who had given everything for their people, would live on. The days that followed were filled with a strange combination of dread and anticipation. Anna knew that she was holding a ticking time bomb in her hands. The truth about the 16 women, buried for decades, was now too big to ignore. The documents, photographs, and confessions had all led her to this moment. But with every step closer to exposing the conspiracy, the danger increased. Anna's first step was to contact the press. She had already reached out to a few trusted journalists, but her decision wasn't taken lightly. The forces at play were vast and powerful, and she knew that bringing this story to the media meant opening a floodgate of retaliation. The church, the government, the military, they would all do whatever they could to protect their interests. They had buried this truth for years, and now that truth was ready to come to the surface. She made sure to keep the details of the story under wraps for now. No leaks, no premature press releases. She would control the narrative, and she would ensure the families of the women were the first to know the full extent of what had happened to their loved ones. Anna met with a small group of journalists from a well-known investigative news outlet. They were careful, quiet, knowing that what they were about to unveil could shatter everything they had ever known about their town, their church, and their government. The room was filled with tension. The journalists had heard the rumors, the whispers about the missing women, the suspicious deaths, the dark history of the church. But this was the moment of truth, and the moment was as heavy as the air in the room. "Anna," one of the reporters said softly, his voice barely audible. "This is bigger than we thought. You know that, right? Exposing this could tear the town apart." Anna nodded. "It already has been torn apart," she replied. "This isn't just about the women. This is about everything we've been told, and everything we've been lied to about. This goes much deeper than anyone realizes." As the reporters began to review the evidence, the military documents, the confessions, the ledger from the church, they became increasingly aware of the depth of the conspiracy. The connections between the church, the military, and the corporations were staggering. They had always assumed that the church was simply a sanctuary, a place of refuge. But now, they could see the web of control and manipulation that had been spun around the native communities. These women had not just been taken because of their activism. They had been erased because they were standing in the way of a massive corporate takeover of the land that had belonged to the tribes for centuries. The journalists worked quickly, gathering their resources, corroborating the documents, and confirming the facts. Within hours, they had a draft story that would send shockwaves through the entire region. But as the team prepared to take the story public, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was late at night when Anna received an anonymous tip. The message was simple. "We know what you're doing. Stop now, or there will be consequences." She wasn't sure whether the message came from someone within the church, the government, or even outside forces. But it was clear that the powerful players who had been protecting the truth were aware of what she was about to do. Anna felt a surge of fear, but also a sense of resolve. She couldn't back down now, not when the women's stories were finally being heard. She pressed forward with the journalists, knowing that the first wave of their story would be just the beginning. She was prepared to face the consequences, whatever they may be. The women had fought, and they had died for the truth. Now, it was time for the truth to come to light. As the journalists prepared to release the first part of the story, Anna received an unexpected phone call. It was from Tommy Littlefeather, the elder who had first come forward to help her with the investigation. His voice was urgent, almost frantic. "Anna," he said, his breath heavy, "you need to stop. They're watching you. They know what you've uncovered. This goes deeper than just the church. You're dealing with big players now, people with connections far beyond this town." Anna paused, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Who are we dealing with here?" "There's more at stake than the women's deaths," Tommy replied, his voice trembling. "The land, the resources, everything. They've been planning this for years, and you're about to expose it all." Anna's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that Tommy was right. This wasn't just about the deaths of the women. It was about the land and the power that had been taken from them. If they could keep the women's deaths a secret, they could continue to control everything: the land, the resources, the voices of the people. The truth was a dangerous thing, and Anna had become a threat to everything they had been trying to protect. As Anna prepared to move forward with the journalists, the weight of what she was about to do began to sink in. The women had died because they had been a threat to the system. And now, Anna herself was about to become a target. But the truth needed to be exposed, and Anna knew that there was no turning back. The world needed to know what had happened to the women, and those responsible needed to be held accountable. But as the story went live, Anna couldn't help but wonder, who else would be silenced in order to keep the truth hidden? The moment Anna hit send on the email, she felt a wave of relief mixed with deep fear. The truth was finally out. The first article was live, the headline a sharp, glaring accusation. 16 Native women silenced by church and government. The hidden truth behind their disappearance. The media storm hit within hours. The town, once shrouded in secrecy, now had its buried history exposed to the world. The names of the 16 women were no longer whispers. They were loud. They were alive again in every news outlet, every discussion, every home. But Anna knew the real fight was just beginning. The articles were out, but the backlash would be fierce. Powerful figures, from the church to corporate interests to government officials, were going to stop at nothing to silence her. They had buried the truth for so long, and now that truth was threatening to destroy the foundations of everything they had built. The next few days felt like a blur. Calls flooded in from local authorities, from church representatives, from government officials, all urging Anna to stop. Some made threats, others tried to bribe her, promising her a future free from persecution if she backed down. But Anna refused to be intimidated. She had the truth on her side. The women's voices were finally being heard, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence them again. But Anna had no idea just how far this web of corruption reached. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how ingrained the conspiracy was. How many lives had been destroyed to protect the interests of a few powerful figures. They weren't just protecting their actions from 1982, they were protecting the entire system that had allowed this to continue for decades. One evening, as Anna sat in her office, reviewing new evidence she had uncovered, documents, photographs, and old files, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was gravelly, but unmistakable. "Anna, I told you to stop. You didn't listen," the voice said, low and threatening. "You've made a dangerous mistake." It was John Harrington, the military officer whose involvement in the women's disappearance had been exposed in the documents. He was still at the center of the web that controlled so much of what had happened. The same man who had wielded power to erase Native resistance, who had orchestrated the women's capture and silencing. He was now warning Anna, but it was clear he was not just talking about the story anymore. "Don't think you're untouchable," Harrington continued, his voice more sinister now. "There's more at play here than you realize. You're putting everyone at risk. If you don't stop, you'll regret it." Anna felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The threat was real, but Anna knew what had to be done. She had come too far. The women's deaths would not be in vain. "Why don't you tell me everything you've been hiding, Harrington?" Anna shot back, her voice steady. "The world deserves to know the truth. It's too late to stop now." There was silence on the other end of the line, a tense pause before Harrington spoke again, but this time his tone was colder. "We'll see about that," he muttered before hanging up. Anna sat there, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. The truth had been exposed. The cover-up was unraveling, and she was right in the middle of it all. The following week, Anna's story gained international attention. National news outlets began to pick up the investigation, and public pressure on the church, the government, and the military grew to a breaking point. The stories that had once been relegated to hushed whispers in dark corners were now being screamed across the world. There were protests, petitions, and calls for justice from all corners of the globe. But there was one more revelation that Anna had been dreading. The story of Father Michael Westridge had finally broken. Investigative reporters had dug into his background and found even more incriminating evidence. Not only had he been involved in the disappearances, but he had also been personally profiting from the corporate deals that had led to the land thefts, using his position to manipulate and control land acquisitions for outsiders, while exploiting his religious authority for personal gain. The backlash against the church was intense. Protesters gathered at the church's doors, demanding answers. The clergy had nowhere to hide. Some spoke out, offering apologies, while others tried to distance themselves from the horrors that had been uncovered. But the damage had already been done. In the wake of the scandal, the church's involvement in the forced disappearances became a national conversation, and as more voices came forward, from survivors, from family members, from those who had witnessed the dark operations of the church, the pieces began to fall into place. The truth had finally come to light, and it was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The investigation took a more legal turn after the revelations. Government hearings were held, calling for accountability. Military officials, including John Harrington, were summoned to testify, and slowly but surely, the weight of the truth began to crush the facade that had hidden it all for so long. But it wasn't easy. Anna worked tirelessly to ensure that the investigation reached its full potential. She made sure the families of the 16 women were heard and that their loved ones received the justice they had been denied for so many years. The final breakthrough came when Father Michael Westridge, under immense public pressure, was arrested. His trial was a national spectacle, and as the details of his crimes were aired publicly, the world could finally see the full scope of the evil that had been hidden beneath the church's walls for decades. His arrest, while a victory, was only a part of the larger story. The justice wasn't just for Father Westridge. It was for the 16 women who had been silenced. The women's bodies, once buried beneath the church floor, were now honored by memorials, and their names were no longer forgotten. They had fought, and they had died for something much greater than themselves. As Anna stood before the memorial, the weight of what had been uncovered settled on her shoulders. The road to this moment had been long and painful, filled with obstacles, threats, and moments of doubt. But she had succeeded. The truth was now known. The voices of the 16 women would never again be silenced. Their legacy would live on, not in the dark corners of forgotten history, but in the hearts of those who would carry their memory forward.